The second element is the device. And device means any physical thing that we use to identify ourselves. That's usually a card, a driver's license, a passport. But I would argue that as we move into the 21st century, again, in the interest of promoting our security and the security of our identity, we can move to more sophisticated devices, tokens of the kind that are now used, for example, for some people in the computer area. Tokens which basically generate numbers that change every 30 seconds. Physical devices that are very difficult to copy. That's a very, very useful tool in terms of making it harder and harder to imitate or counterfeit your particular form of documentation or your particular form of device identification. Of course, documents can be stolen. Even devices can be stolen. So here again, I would argue that using a device alone as if you have a really important issue of identification, leaves a vulnerability. The last element is fingerprint, biometric. That is unique. As far as I know, no one's ever proven two people have the same fingerprints. And that is a terrific and increasingly useful identifier. Now, my real argument is to take all these three and use them all or two of the three of them together in combination. Because that, in the long run, gives you both the most accurate and the most secure form of identification. If you have a device that is activated only by or in conjunction with your use of a biometric, and if it further has to be validated by a piece of secret information or description, it would become exceptionally difficult for anybody to somehow pretend to be you or to impersonate you. And at the same time, if you were perchance to lose the device or the card, if you were perchance to have your secret information somehow stolen and released, you'd still have another or two other forms of security for your identity. It would make it, nothing is impossible, of course, it would make it exceptionally difficult to steal your identity. And I believe that as we move forward, moving to this model of identification is what the public will demand to safeguard our most valuable assets. I conclude by saying this. Although I'm speaking as a government official and we see this issue in the government all the time, it is not largely or even maybe mainly a government issue. It's also an issue for the private sector. Whether you're doing business with eBay or you're engaging in a financial transaction or you're trying to get a job, the issue of identity is important to the private sector. I think our role in government can catalyze the move to the next level of these kinds of secure identification by laying out performance metrics that we will deem acceptable for purposes of government identification, and then having those performance metrics get driven into the private sector. And I'm willing to bet that in very short order the private sector adopts those metrics as a gold standard for all the business and personal concerns where we rely upon identity. I think in that way we achieve homeland security, we achieve personal security, we achieve economic security, and we achieve privacy. Thank you very much.
Today at the City Club of Cleveland, we're listening to a special forum featuring the Honorable Michael Chertoff, Secretary of the Department of Homeland Security. Now, we would like to return to our speaker for our traditional City Club question and answer period. We welcome questions from everyone, including guests. Holding the microphones today are City Club Operations Assistant Maria Dabata and Outreach Coordinator Deborah Agosti. Secretary, first question, please.
I'd like to ask a question about even-handedness as we look at the effort to control who comes into the country, who's here legally, and who can work here. I support the effort to try to come up with the kind of secure system that you've described. I see the many competing values that are contending as you try to do so. But as I look out on our immigration management system now, I see Swiss cheese. There's a tremendous number of people, over 10 million people is the estimate, who are in the country who we don't think are supposed to be here, and they work. That's how they survive. And indeed, we seem to need their help. So I think you need to try to bring us systemic thinking about this whole question of how we handle who we are. I focus specifically on the prosecutions which were brought against undocumented workers in, I believe, Kansas or Nebraska, the slaughterhouse workers who were imprisoned, I think, because they were undocumented, in a way that I think was considered drastically harsher than had been the custom. So I ask about the even-handedness of that kind of action when we seem to have such a flawed system of governing who is here and who is allowed to work.
Well, let me first say, I spent a lot of time in 2007 at the request of the President trying to get comprehensive immigration reform passed. That would have been a system that would have allowed us to continue to increase enforcement at the border, but would also have allowed people who are here illegally to pay a fine and find some way to regularize themselves, assuming they hadn't done anything other than working illegally, and also would have created a temporary worker program to deal with the economic needs. So I completely agree with you that a truly fair and the most efficient systemic response would find a way to bring in temporary workers legally, and would also find a way for people who are here illegally to pay a punishment. They did violate the law, but to find some way to regularize themselves. However, Congress chose not to pass that bill. And that's notwithstanding the fact the President put a lot of personal time into it. I put a lot of personal time into it. There were many members of Congress who pushed hard for it, but not enough. So we find ourselves in a situation where there is a certain unevenness built into the law. Now, it is also true that many people are surprised to find that we are seriously enforcing the law now for the first time. And I sometimes hear people say, God, for years, nobody paid attention to this stuff. And for years, nobody cared if there were illegal workers as long as they didn't commit some other crime. But of course, that was the very same argument that was used to derail comprehensive immigration reform. The argument was the government is not serious about enforcing the law. In 1986, there was an amnesty. There was a promise of law enforcement in the future. The promise was violated. More people came in illegally. And now all the government wants to do is continue to fill the bucket up, legalize and fill the bucket up. And that is a perhaps cynical, but unfortunately a response that is based on experience. So somewhat to the surprise of everybody, we determined that we actually would enforce the law, because that's what our obligation is. And that's not to say we don't think that there will come a time Congress should revisit comprehensive immigration reform, but until they do, the law as it is should be enforced, and that's for two reasons. One is, that's what you should do. That's what we're sworn to do. And the second reason is because we owe it to the American public to show when the government commits to do something, it's going to do it. Now, the limit of resources means there's a limit to what you can do at any one time. And to some extent, statistics indicate that there's already been an impact in terms of a decrease in flow and people actually leaving. But in some ways, you're complaining about the typical problem that arises with any law enforcement, which is, since you can't arrest everybody who violates the law, those who happen to be caught wind up paying a price, and those who don't get caught don't pay a price. When I was doing drug prosecutions as a federal prosecutor, I heard that all the time. The people who happen to get caught moving a load of coke or methamphetamine got punished really harsh, and those who didn't get punished. It was even a more powerful objection on Wall Street when we did prosecutions for corporate fraud. I heard from people on Wall Street, well, it's always been done. We've always had insider trading. People never paid attention if we cooked the books. I wish I had a nickel for every time I heard people say when we did accounting scandals like Enron. Nobody ever cared. This has just been dealt with as a bookkeeping matter. That was not a persuasive argument to the thousands who lost their pensions when Enron went down. And so we did, with respect to white-collar criminals, what we're doing here. We said, look, we can't do everybody, but for those who we do catch, we will in fact enforce the law, and we'll enforce it in a tough way. So I think what you're raising is an issue that applies across the board to law enforcement. And I can only tell you, based on many years of being involved in law enforcement,